Killer Bee True Crime Series, Episode 3, Part 2, The Marshall Street Madman. Due to the graphic nature of this killer's crimes, listener discretion is advised. This episode includes discussions of murder, sexual assault, rape, violence, and torture. Gary Heidnik popped open the champagne and began pouring it into 5 cups. He watched the women down their drinks, although he hardly touched his own. He didn't really like drinking, but he wanted to celebrate. All the same, he believed 2 of his women, Josephine and Sandra, might be pregnant. After drinks, Gary grabbed the bag of Chinese takeout and began setting the feast out onto the table. He enjoyed seeing his women gape at the food in disbelief. Now they'd seen how generous he could be when they deserved it. The women ate silently. Nobody was in the mood for conversation. The only noise they could hear besides the radio Gary insisted on blasting was the rattle of the chains that bound their ankles and wrists. It was a horrible sound, one that haunted their dreams, a constant reminder of their captivity. It was a sound they could never escape. On November 27, 1986, most Americans were gathered around the table, enjoying Thanksgiving with their loved ones. 43-year-old Gary Heidnik wasn't observing the holiday, but he did have reason to celebrate. He had just completed the first step of his plot, and everything had gone off without a hitch. After convincing a 25-year-old sex worker, Josefina Rivera, to come back to his Philadelphia home, Gary attacked her, forced her into his basement, chained her to the wall. Josephine thought she was going to die, but Gary had other plans. Once she was securely restrained, he moved to the center of the room. There was a spot where he'd torn up the concrete floor and dug a pit out of the dirt below. Josephine watched. Gary grabbed a shovel and began scooping up dirt, making the pit even larger. He talked to her as he dug, explained he wanted to have kids, lots of them. He told her he tried starting having a family before, but the state had intervened and removed the kids from his custody. Gary was fuming about the injustice. Even on her terror, Josephine could tell that Gary was an intensely lonely man. He wanted children to fill the void, telling Josephine the world owed him those babies. So, he intended to bring 10 women down to his basement, hold them captive, impregnate each one. He told her, "We'll be one big happy family." He seemed thrilled by the idea of having a collection of human underlings to lord over a group of women and children who were totally dependent on him. Josephina was terrified. She realized she'd fallen in the hands of a monster, but she wasn't going to submit to Gary's twisted desires without a fight. As soon as Gary went back upstairs, Josephina shuffled across the floor as far as her chains would allow her. She made it to one of the windows along the wall and used a discarded pool cue she'd found on the floor, pushed it open. Then she launched her body halfway out, but the chain around her ankle held tight. She couldn't go any further. She began to scream, hoping someone might hear her, but in Gary's high-crime neighborhood, nobody gave her cries a second thought. The only person that responded was Gary. He rushed down to drag her all the way back into the basement and began to beat her until she cried that she couldn't take anymore. Then he shoved her into the pit. It was barely big enough for Josephina to fit inside. She had to curl up with her neck bent and her legs folded against her chest, but Gary didn't care much about her comfort. He covered the hole with a piece of plywood and placed the bag of dirt on top to weigh it down. Trapped underground, Josephine sobbed. Gary turned on the radio to drown out her cries. Then he went back upstairs. He was already making a plan to capture his next victim. 24-year-old Sandra Lindsay was an easy target because she already knew and trusted Gary. They met while Sandra was at the Alwyn Institute, a local nonprofit that serviced individuals with autism, intellectual and developmental disabilities. Gary frequently hung around the institute to pick up women and to bring them back for sex. After meeting Gary, Sandra agreed to have sex with him several times, although it's not clear she had the capacity to give actual consent. Gary even gotten her pregnant, but she terminated the pregnancy on her own. Soon afterwards, Gary heard about the abortion. He offered $1,000 to let him impregnate her again, but she declined. So he decided that if he couldn't bribe her, he'd force her into doing it. On November 29th, about 2 days after kidnapping Josephine, Gary found Sandra running errands at the corner store near her house. He coerced her to come home with him. Once inside, he dragged her into the basement where Josephine was still trapped in the pit. He pulled Josephine out and resumed digging the hole. He needed to make it big enough so both women could fit in. Afterwards, he raped them both. His birthing harem, as he called it, was underway, but it wasn't long before Gary's scheme hit a snag. When Sandra Lindsay didn't return home that night, her family was worried. They began calling her friends and asking her whereabouts. One suggested she might be with Gary, so on the morning of November 30th, Sandra's sisters and 2 of her cousins showed up at Gary's house looking for her. Gary refused to answer, but he knew they'd be back. So later that day, he brought a pen and paper into the basement and dictated a message for Sandra. She wrote, "Dear Mom, do not worry. I will call." Underneath, she signed her name and then addressed the envelope. Gary drove the letter all the way to New York City, where he dropped it off at the mailbox. He wanted Sandra's family to see the postmark and assumed she'd run away. But when Sandra's mother received the letter, she didn't believe Sandra had written it of her own free will. It wasn't like her to leave town on her own. According to the author of the book Cellar of Horror, when she reported her daughter missing to the police, there was little response. Once the responding officer saw the letter, he figured Sandra was safe and would return home when she was ready. Yet Sandra's mother insisted he look into Gary. The first name meant nothing to the officer. If he'd been able to see Gary's criminal record, it would have given him pause. After all, Gary had kidnapped a woman with an intellectual disability just like Sandra. He'd even gone to prison for it. Unfortunately, when the officer questioned Sandra's family about Gary, the friend misspelled Gary's last name. When the officer eventually typed the name into the system, there were no results. So, he gave the case less priority and made few follow-up efforts to search for Sandra. In the meantime, Gary took extra steps to avoid getting caught. He started soundproofing his basement to ensure that no one would hear his captive screams. He also beat both women relentlessly to discourage them from trying to run away. Weeks went by. Gary kept Sandra and Josephine shackled 24 hours a day. He didn't let them bathe or comb their hair. When nobody came to rescue the women, they became defeated, and Gary grew confident. By December 22nd, 1986, he was ready for a new addition to his harem. That Monday afternoon, he cruised around the streets of Philadelphia in his Cadillac until he came across a 19-year-old woman named Lisa Thomas. Lisa fit the profile of all Gary's victims. She was a young black woman with low income. When she saw Gary's fancy car, she waved. It caught his attention. He pulled over and offered her a ride wherever she was going. Impressed by the car, Lisa agreed. As they drove, Gary flirted with her. He piled on the compliments and asked her if she'd like to come to Atlantic City with him. When she replied that she had nothing to wear for such a trip, he drove her to Sears, handed her a $50 bill, and told her to buy whatever she wanted. Lisa was won over. After purchasing a few new outfits, she decided to go home with Gary. They went back to his house, and after he'd given her a glass of wine, she reportedly passed out due to the alcohol, a reaction with an allergy medicine she had previously taken. As she regained her senses, Gary brought her to his room and had sex with her. Afterwards, she asked if he'd give her a ride to a friend's house. Gary snapped. He grabbed her by the throat and began strangling her. She tried to fight him off, but he wouldn't let go. Instead, he snapped a pair of handcuffs on her wrists and brought her down to the basement. Downstairs, Gary pulled Josephine and Sandra out of the pit where he'd left them. He introduced them to Lisa, as if welcoming a new guest. He then offered his prisoners a meal of peanut butter sandwiches. But before they were allowed to eat, he raped his newest prisoner. For Lisa, the assault was a grim initiation into what would be a daily horrific routine, and there was no end in sight. On New Year's Day in 1987, Gary went scouting again. He found 23-year-old Deborah Johnson Dudley and brought her home. A little over 2 weeks later, he met an 18-year-old sex worker named Jacqueline Askins. She went home with him, expecting a typical job. When she got there, he showed her some arcade games he collected and started playing one of them. While she was distracted, he put her in a headlock and dragged her to the basement. Gary was elated to have 4 women under his control, but he expressed his pleasure in increasingly depraving acts of cruelty. He beat the women with a shovel handle. Sometimes he would force them to beat each other with it as well. He didn't want the women to develop camaraderie and rise up against him, so he tried to make them resent each other. He did this by playing favorites, especially with Josephine, as she was the most compliant. She had worked out obedience meant survival. Gary also manipulated the women by picking one and only one reward with special treats like ice cream or Chinese food. His tactics worked. Eventually, the women were too worn down to resist him. But even when they cooperated, it didn't stop Gary from punishing them. It was a compulsion he couldn't resist. Author's note: of all types of rapists, sexual sadists are the most likely to escalate their violence to homicide. In February, after more than 2 months of being held captive, 24-year-old Sandra Lindsay became ill. She was vomiting and feverish. Perhaps Gary was pleased because he thought her sickness might be a sign of pregnancy, but his mood soured when Sandra lost her appetite. Gary worried that his baby wasn't getting enough to eat. He tried to force feed her some bread. When she refused, he became enraged and hooked one of her chains to a beam on the ceiling. She hung there for at least 2 days, suspended by one wrist. It's possible that the weight of her own limp body squeezed the air out of her lungs and caused her to asphyxiate. This is similar to crucifixion. When Gary saw that Sandra had died, his reaction was cold and calculating. He felt no remorse about torturing the woman to death. All he cared about was getting rid of the body, so he wouldn't get caught. But he knew he had to be careful. Sandra's family had already shown up at his place looking for her. Despite his efforts to make it look like she ran away to New York, Gary knew he might be the first suspect if Sandra was found dead. Gary had an idea on how to solve that problem. He used an electric saw to dismember her body. In court records for his insanity defense, they state that Gary ground up the body parts that he could and fed them to his dogs. He set aside her skull and tossed it in a boiling pot of water. Other parts he tried to incinerate in his oven as he roasted her body parts. The smell of burning flesh filled the house. The women downstairs gagged from the stench. The smell was even noticeable from outside. Gary's neighbors had ignored some of the questionable behavior before, but when they caught wind of the stomach-churning scent, they called police. On February 10th, about 5 p.m., police questioned Gary about the particular smell. Gary said that he burned a roast. He seemed calm and lucid, so the officer didn't see any reason to go inside and look around. Satisfied, he went on his way. But Sandra's death and the police visit rattled Gary. Suddenly he worried this scheme was unraveling, and perhaps the women sensed he was vulnerable. Deborah Dudley, the most rebellious of Gary's captives, helped devise an attack plan. She had found an iron pipe buried in the dirt under the floor, and when she attacked, she wanted the others to attack with her. However, the plan fell apart before Deborah could strike. Apparently, Josephine confessed to Gary, wanting to earn his trust and perhaps buy her freedom. When Gary found out, he punished the women. He took screwdrivers and drove them into the women's ears, piercing their eardrums. He reasoned that if they couldn't hear, it would be harder for them to devise any more schemes to overpower him. Only Josephine was spared. The more Gary inflicted pain on his prisoners, the more he seemed to enjoy it. As bad as the first few months of captivity were, the worst was still to come. Gary continued to beat and rape the women daily. He also taunted them with threats that he would grind up pieces of Sandra's body and mix it in their food. Then in March 1987, he came up with a new method of torture. Gary cut off the end of an electric extension cord and stripped the protective coating, leaving the bare wire. He began administering shocks on the women whenever it suited him. On Wednesday, March 18th, he decided they needed to be punished more severely. He ordered Deborah, Lisa, Jacqueline to sit in the underground pit and fill it with water. As the women sat shivering in the homemade pool, Gary prepared the extension cord. Either he or Josephine, under his instruction, pressed the live wire into the metal chains that restrained the women. An electric current ran through the metal and coursed through the prisoners. Moments later, 23-year-old Deborah went silent and limp. The other women called out, "You've killed her." Gary scoffed. When he looked down and peered into the pit, he saw Deborah slumped over. Her face was underwater. Gary pulled the woman out and laid Deborah's body across the floor. After confirming she was dead, he looked at the others and said, "Aren't you glad it wasn't one of you?" Gary made the most of Deborah's death. He saw it as an opportunity to tighten his control over his captives. He grabbed a pen and paper and told Josephine to write out a confession letter admitting her role in Deborah's death. He told her, "If you go to the cops, I can use this as evidence that you killed Debbie." Gary made the other women sign the sheet as witnesses with the letter. He was satisfied he could blackmail Josephine whenever he wanted. He was so certain now that she would never defy him. He decided that he could grant her a little more freedom. He removed Josephine's chains, gave her a clean shirt and a pair of jeans to wear to allow her to go upstairs. Over the next few days, he gave Josephine free rein of the house. He acted as if she were his girlfriend, confiding in her, ruminating on what he could do if he were caught. As far as he was concerned, he and Josephine were accomplices, both responsible for Deborah's death. He truly believed that she couldn't go to the police without implicating herself. So he enlisted her help in getting rid of Deborah's body. Gary wrapped the corpse in a blanket and carried it out to his car. He told Josephine to get in the passenger seat. Gary drove them about 40 miles east into the forest of New Jersey. He parked at a desolate spot in the middle of Pine Barrens. Josephine watched over the car while Gary dumped Deborah's body among the trees. Then he returned to the vehicle. As they drove home, Gary began plotting again. First Sandra, then Deborah were gone. He wanted 10 women to birth his children. Now he was just down to 3. It was time to scout for more victims. The following morning, Gary sought out a sex worker he'd hired in the past, 24-year-old Agnes Adams. He paid her to perform oral sex on him the month before, but apparently Gary wasn't interested in kidnapping her at that point. This time, he offered her $30 for an appointment, luring her into his home. He brought her to his room to have sex, but as they got ready to leave, he grabbed her by the neck, handcuffed her, and dragged her to the basement. In the aftermath of the attack, he felt confident he could repopulate his birthing harem in no time. Meanwhile, Josephine had kept a close eye on Gary, ready to take advantage of his good mood. The next day, she asked if she could go visit her family. By then, she had convinced him that she had no interest in running away. She told him that if she was allowed to leave for a few hours, she'd bring back a new woman for the basement. Gary agreed. He still had her confession letter as insurance, and he was so convinced that he had so cowed and manipulated the woman into submission, it didn't occur to him that she could be tricking him. On the night of March 24th, 1987, Gary dropped Josephine off at her old neighborhood. Before she left, he told her to meet him at a gas station parking lot at midnight. She promised she would. Once Gary was out of sight, Josephine raced to the apartment of an old boyfriend, Vincent. As soon as he opened the door, Josephine opened her mouth and her story came spilling out. She told him everything. Hearing her tale of rape and torture, Vincent was ready to grab a weapon and go looking for Gary himself, but Josephine had convinced him to call the police. They called 911 from a payphone. Moments later, 2 patrolmen came to meet them. Josephine repeated her story to the officers. She told them that 3 other women were still in captivity, and she was terrified Gary would kill them if she didn't return. The officers stared at her in disbelief. The accusations seemed too grotesque to be true, but when Josephine showed them the marks on her arms and wrists, scars left by the prolonged use of handcuffs and chains, they finally agreed to investigate. Josephine had told the police where Gary would be waiting to pick her up at midnight, and the police agreed to check it out when they arrived at the gas station. Gary was sitting in his Cadillac. The officers drew their guns and approached the car, telling Gary to step outside. Gary raised his hands and exited the car. Despite the guns being pointed at him, he didn't seem to be worried. He asked them if they were coming to hassle him about the child support he owed his estranged wife, Betty. Josephine stepped forward. According to one of the officers who arrived at the scene, 2 other girls. The officers placed Gary under arrest and took him into custody. Meanwhile, more officers arrived to take Josephine's statement. While retelling her story, Josephine grew increasingly agitated, asking if anyone was going to go back to the house for the other women. She asked them again and again, growing frantic. It was another 4 hours before police were finally given the command to search Gary's house, and despite Josephine's testimony, none of them were prepared for what they'd find. Around 5 a.m. that morning, police surrounded Gary's home on North Marshall Street. They broke down the front door with a crowbar and stampeded into the house. Immediately, their senses were assaulted. The smell of death hung in the air, and the television and radio were blaring. The thermostat was set so blistering high, the heat and odor made it disorienting. As the police trampled through the kitchen, one of the officers spotted fragments of what could have been human bones in a roasting pan. But a far more horrifying discovery awaited them in the basement. They came downstairs to find Lisa and Jacqueline chained to the wall. The two women were asleep. They jerked awake as the officers surrounded them for a moment. They were too bewildered to understand they were being rescued. When hit with the realization, they began to cry in relief, shouting they were saved. They were saved. They pointed to the pit in the middle of the room, covered with plywood and weighted down with sandbags. When the police peered inside, they found Agnes Adams. Agnes was terrified, but she was alive. She'd only been trapped a couple of days. The other two women looked shockingly malnourished. Their wrists and ankles were covered in sores and abrasions. After freeing them with bolt cutters, the authorities transported them to the hospital. Their agonizing ordeal was finally over, but that didn't change the fates of Sandra Lindsay and Deborah Dudley. Sandra's mother was devastated to learn that her suspicions were correct. All along, she had pushed police to investigate Gary, but they essentially dropped the matter. Her mother told reporters she could have saved them all. The authorities were certainly paying attention now. Now, after finding Sandra Lindsay's remains, they went to work looking for more bodies. They couldn't discount the fact that Gary had been killing for years. Over the next few days, they thoroughly searched Gary's apartment on North Marshall Street, bringing in backhoes and sifters to excavate his yard. They conducted a similar search at the house on Cedar Avenue, where Gary had lived years before. As authorities pored over Gary's life with a fine-tooth comb, Gary himself remained locked up in Philadelphia's detention center, without bail. He was attacked by another prisoner shortly after he was detained, so for his own safety, he was transferred to the psychiatric unit of the penitentiary. Apparently, these precautions couldn't protect Gary from himself. A little over a week after his arrest, he tried to hang himself in the bathroom using his shirt. The guards rescued him before it was too late, which meant Gary was alive to stand trial for capital murder. But the lawyers had to contend with another major obstacle, the question of Gary's mental fitness. A few days after his suicide attempt, Gary hired a defense lawyer. The lawyer wasted no time in laying the groundwork for an insanity defense for his client. He even started describing Gary as insane to the press. Gary's demeanor added to this image. Reporters noted and commented on it. Gary would wear the same outfit again and again. A dirty buckskin jacket with a fringe and an old Hawaiian shirt. During these appearances, he often looked vacant. He even drooled on occasion, though this was perhaps because he'd been prescribed large doses of Thorazine, a medication used to treat psychotic disorders while in custody. Prosecutors could only hope that Gary's odd behavior wouldn't sway a jury. If Gary were declared insane, he would likely spend the rest of his life in a psychiatric hospital. The prosecutors wanted a death penalty. The prosecutors agreed with the defense that he was mentally ill, but he did not meet the requirements for insanity. They argued he made the calculated efforts to soundproof his basement, the letter he had one of his captives write, then mailing it from New York, and that he made sure to hide the bodies so he would avoid detection. Whatever delusions Gary experienced, his actions demonstrated he fully was aware that what he was doing was breaking the law. The trial lasted 2 weeks. In July 1988, the jury returned a verdict. They found Gary guilty of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and rape. Gary waived all of his appeals. He wanted to die. Shortly after his sentencing, there was one more suicide attempt. He had hoarded the pills he'd been given and took them all at once. This put him in a coma for 2 weeks. Despite his efforts in waiving his rights, his case took 8 years to proceed through the court system. His execution was scheduled for April 1997. However, as this date approached, there was another delay from an unlikely source. Gary's 19-year-old daughter, Maxine, had never met her father. She was removed from his custody as an infant. She petitioned the court, extending his execution 2 more years. But on July 6, 1999, 55-year-old Gary Heinick died by lethal injection. Gary's death, more than 20 years ago, was the last execution carried out by the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. This has been the Killer Bee True Crime Series, Episode 3, Part 2. Thank you for listening, and God bless.